work, and today we are going to be painting a great waterfall landscape. I'm personally going to be using oils in all of my tools, materials, brushes. They'll all be listed in the video description. If you'd like help with the drawing process, you can find the traceable up over on Patreon, where you can also find all of my ebooks, bonus hour-long lessons, other traceables, and a bunch of fun things like individual critiques. So if you're interested in any of that, go check it out up there. But with that, let's jump into today's painting lesson. Before I spill my coffee, I tend to move my hand a lot when I do these intros. Kind of scary. So let's get into it. So to begin, here we have our palette and all of the different colors we'll be using. Now, something you've probably noticed, there actually isn't any green on this palette, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mix all of those myself with this blue and these yellows. That's just going to help us simplify things, but also give us a little bit more control. With that said, we're not going to start with the green, we're going to start up here in the sky with a blue, and I'm going to do so with this 1 centimeter wide flat-headed brush. So I'm going to start by just taking some of our blue, moving it to a clean spot here on our palette. I'll take a good amount of titanium white, put that right beside, and I'll start mixing the two. Looking for different gradients, changes, and just trying to decide how bright I want it. Looking at all of this, I think it's all quite dark. We'll grab more titanium white, we'll mix outside. Getting much better. I like that, let's try again. Don't always go with the first pigment or the first mixture you have on your palette. Try a couple, figure out which ones you actually like. I think I want something much brighter like that, but it's still fairly saturated. So I'm going to desaturate it by taking just a hint of our Mars Black here. Tapping that on the edge to get the excess off, and then I'll work it back into our blue. And that just toned it down a little bit as it mixed with the white, and in the end, rendered something a little bit more gray. Now I'm going to start in the sky here on what looks like our horizon, or at least the area where land masses meet the sky. And I'm going to work along those edges while I still have a lot of paint, because that's when I'll be able to deliver the sharpest applications. And I'm just going to start working up like that. I'm rotating my brush to get the best edge I possibly can. And you can go back over your pigment with a very soft touch like this to smooth out a lot of it should you want to. So I'm just going to continue moving this up until about this mark right here. So here I'm taking more of that slightly diluted, very bright blue. I'm applying it right on top of my previous applications, and then I work horizontally until we kind of smooth it out. Now, our pigment is quite opaque because titanium white is quite opaque, which means it isn't really see-through, but you can see through it just a hint when you apply a lot of pressure with your stroke. And you can kind of see a little bit of orange showing through, and that's giving us a nice warm effect in what would have been a very cool looking sky. So that's kind of why we do the base layer the way we do. It just gives us a little bit more complexity in our color without having to do too much more mixing. Now that we're at the top here though, we're going to make it a little bit darker, and I think I'll actually just use the pigment that we had right here. Apply that at the top. I don't want it to be a stark contrast. It's our first real application here. And with oils, they build up really quickly, and when you have a lot of them, it can be quite difficult to go back and rework that area. So I like to apply very minimal amounts, and then once I have it the way I want, I'll go back in and do a bit more of a thick application. Here I'm blending this into this by just working in these diagonal strokes, taking this pigment, dragging it down here, taking this pigment, dragging it up there, and then I soften. Just going to continue doing this all the way across the top. So now the entirety of the sky is painted from left to right. You can see there's a little bit of a gradient moving up here. This bottom area is slightly lighter than this top area, and that's actually a good thing because it gives us a bit of a gradient, gives us a bit of depth. It makes it look like the light is kind of being emitted from the bottom here and then working its way upwards. And it's also going to draw the eye into the middle of the painting because the eye is drawn to the most bright area of each subject. So that's a good start. I am going to consider clouds, but a little bit later down the line, because if you do them initially, you kind of set a standard for the amount of detail in the piece, and I rather do the detail that I want throughout the piece and then make the sky match that. So with that, we're now going to move on to this area right here, all of the rock, and the rock is quite far in the distance. So I'm going to take a good amount of titanium white, a hint of our blue, not much, just because it's so strong, as you can see. I'll take a hint of Mars Black, and again, just a hint because, yet again, so strong. And I'll mix up a fairly blue-gray. And our mountains in the background here are going to be fairly blue-gray, because they're going to be getting a lot of reflective atmospheric light, and that's going to have a really big impact on how they look. We're not going to see their natural colorings because they're so far away. So I'm mixing something blue because we have so much blue in the atmosphere. And I'm starting to apply the highlight to the mountains. And as you can see, it's a little bit darker than the blue that we have up there in the sky. If you feel it's too blue, you can just take a little bit of extra Mars Black, work that in there, and I'll just kind of fill in the top of this mountain here, quite simply. Then I'll take a little bit of our brown, I'll work that in there, and then from the bottom, I'll work that up. That way it looks like there's more of that blue light reflecting around the top. Again, we're creating another nice little gradient. And now it'll slightly differentiate it from that backing sky. There we go. It will look a little crazy to begin with, but it will really come together and look cohesive in the end. It's one of those things where you just kind of need to trust the process. So with that, I'm mixing more of that really bright version of our pigment, like that. Find another area that kind of protrudes. And right now, I'm putting all of the highlighted areas that are sticking out and are kind of looking to the right-hand side, because I'm going to have the majority of my light working in this way, and that means everything on the side is going to be dark. So let's do a little demonstration of what that's going to look like. Get a little bit of Mars Black in there, a little bit more of our brown. It's pretty dark, but we'll give it a try. You know what? That actually turned out really well. Great. So now you can see a little bit of the shape forming with this protruding, and this kind of facing backwards. I'll do a little bit more in here. And I'm just painting this around the waterfall right now. We'll make it a little bit brighter around the top, throwing in some titanium white. And it's also darker back here. Now there are going to be different levels of darker areas and lighter areas because of course some areas are going to protrude more, which means they'll get more direct light. Some areas will be more in the middle, some will get almost none. So This is something where you kind of have to think about, again, where the light's coming from and how it's affecting your subject. And if there are any subjects blocking that light and making things darker. Using just a little bit of extra Mars black to darken some little crevices, different areas. There we go. I'm just going to continue this process, making everything that's facing this direction dark and everything that's facing this direction light. So now, as you can see, there's a bit of a pattern. We go from dark to lightish to dark to lightish, dark, lightish, dark, lightish, dark, lightish. Now, it's good to build patterns like that because it helps us easily understand kind of what's happening. But once we've established that, we need to make sure that there's diversity in it and that they're not all the same width and that they're all spaced apart a little bit differently. I'm also now going in and building slight little ledges in these areas. So further protrusions, extra little pieces that are popping out, and I'm going in with that slightly highlighted blue-gray. I'm picking areas that look a little bit not complicated, and I'm working those into these darker areas. Now we do have quite a bit of paint on here, so working with it is getting a little bit more difficult. That's okay though. We're going to switch to a smaller flat-headed brush. I believe this one is 4 millimeters wide, but it doesn't need to be exact. I'm going to take a little bit more of that titanium white, work it into our highlight area, and I'm using more titanium white in the current mixture because when we apply paint, it's going to mix with all of our previously applied paints, and all of them are a little bit darker right now. So if we were to mix that same color that we had, we'd get a darker color here on the painting. So I'm going over the edges that are facing the right-hand side because that's where the light is coming from. I'm applying these highlights, and then I'll do a little bit of a blend back, keeping that right-hand side nice and sharp, and this is going to give us the look of light wrapping around more three-dimensional subjects. Just like that. Now, this is all very much in the background, so it's going to look a little bit abstract for a while. Generally, you don't want your backgrounds to be hyper complicated visually, and you don't see a lot of detail in them because the eye just can't recognize that much from that far away. And that's okay. It's also good because it means that our foreground pops more. So we're just trying to create all of these little areas that stick out, that capture slight hints of light. And I'm even going back in with these highlights over the lighter area because, again, our highlight is slightly brighter. There we go. And you can see I'm just slowly applying different areas, building up that detail, connecting them occasionally. Because there are going to be areas that connect from the dark side to the light side. And the dark side is going to have areas that pop out a little bit, and they don't get as much light as the light side, but they get a little bit. If you do too many, just blend it out, make it a little bit less complicated. And as you can see, it's starting to look like rock. Again, it's one of those processes you really just have to believe in the process and that your end vision will turn out the way you want, because initially it takes a bit of work, but that's okay. Makes you a better painter, and the work itself isn't necessarily hard. It just requires a little bit of thought. You can also go into your light area with darker pigments and create little areas that are additional crevices, things of that nature. we'll separate these two. That'll be kind of interesting. You notice how bright it still is? We have these dark edges, but we're making sure that the painting as a whole in the back here is very bright. Taking those highlights, finding a darker area. For the majority of these strokes, by the way, I'm moving down in kind of a slant that's similar to a lot of these rocks. It's just going to make it a bit more dynamic and angular. And it allows me to eventually move down, connect into another one, connect into this one, and that way it's this kind of cohesive stream of applications. Now, I'm going to continue this for quite some time, but I will see you when all of these little taps and strokes are done. So I probably spent another 20 minutes working on this side right here. As you can see, a lot of those highlights now combine into one another, but they're also individual little taps of highlights, and those darker pigments brought up into the light areas. So I thought we'd kind of work on this one together for a little bit too, and I'm going to begin by mixing up a bit more of that highlight. So I'm taking some titanium white right here, taking a hint of Mars black. I wipe off the excess up here, that way it doesn't dilute our actual mixture. And I'll get a little bit of blue, again doing the same thing, just taking off the excess. And then I'll work that over here. Need to make it a bit brighter. And now we'll start kind of combining things like that. See how we brought the darker area into the lighter area? And we can continue playing with that lighter area, building further highlights. You can get a slightly lighter pigment to do this. And a lot of these have been connected, but you can also find the little areas and just do a singular tap, and those can be really nice. But for the most part, my strokes are staying quite consistent in the fact that they are diagonal. Going to work diagonal in the other direction, a little bit in the shadow here, just to make things interesting. I'll also mix a bit of the darker pigment yet again. So I'll take a little bit of Mars black, a little bit of blue, and remember that it's not actually dark, it's just dark relative to the other side. So here's a lot of titanium white, a little bit of extra Mars black, and we'll give that a test. Go into one of the lighter areas. It's a little bit blue heavy, a little bit more than I want, so I'll get more black, more white. If anything's ever too saturated, just add more black and more white. Just a bit more gray, and that's a good darker tone. So here, I'll combine this into this by just taking this and working it into some of those more defined sharp edges. Here I'll do just a tap along the rock there. Separate some of the highlights down here, bring it maybe into here and create a separation between this and this. So I'm just looking to diversify. I'm not worrying too much about detail at this point. I'm just slowly building each area, and I'm jumping back and forth between many. That way I build them together and cohesively, and that way one area doesn't look significantly more detailed than the other. They're all kind of being built up at the same time, under the same circumstances with the same pigments. So now part one of our distant mountains is complete, and we're going to switch back to the 1 centimeter wide brush. So I'm going to head back to my palette, and I'm going to mix a slightly darker variant of the shadow color that we have in there. Now I have that shadow color right here on my palette, so I'm going to mix right beside it, so I have a very honest reference, and I'm going to use slightly less blue than what I did before. Then I'm going to come in right along this edge, and I'm going to start applying that pigment. Now I'm making it slightly less blue because it's closer to us, it's more so in the foreground, and therefore it's getting less of that reflective light. And it's also a little bit darker because you generally want to build contrast as you move forward in your painting, because that light doesn't kind of dilute all of those pigments and those contrasts, so you see things that are a bit more stark and sharp. And I'm applying it here along this edge first, because it's going to show me what it looks like directly beside our previous application, and because again, when you have the cleanest brush with the most amount of pigment, that's the best time to strike. With that said, this is looking a bit too dark, so I'm going to take a hint of titanium white, work that into our mixture, going to come back over portions of our edge, and that's already so much better. Okay, good. It's very subtle, but it makes a big difference. Again, don't go with the first pigment you mix. Try different things, don't be afraid to experiment a little. And when you're doing that first application, make sure that it's not that much pigment. You want to slowly build it up over time. Otherwise, going back and doing this would be rather difficult. With that said, if you ever do find yourself in that scenario, you can just take some paper towel or painting cloth and wipe off that pigment, then proceed from there. The canvas should be relatively void of any mud from there. Just building our way up. And much like we did with the distant mountains, we're going to assign darker areas. So I'll make this darker, like that. I'll say maybe this area will be a little bit lighter, then there will be another darker area in here. Maybe we'll have a little bit of a darker area up top. Maybe we'll work a little bit of that dark pigment down here. And everything else will be light. So I'm just going to go ahead, I'm going to take more of this exact pigment, fill it in all of those areas, and then we'll come back in and do the light pigment right after. So now I've mapped in all of the shadow side of this right here, and I took the time to do this one as well, just because they're at a similar depth level in the painting, and they'll have a very similar value set. With that said, I did do some fun little things, like I did this little drop down right here, that way there's a highlight here, there's a highlight here, it makes it look like this protrudes out farther than that, and I did that in a couple of areas throughout. I also did some little divots. These are things that we kind of saved for later on in this, but you can save some time and just interject some larger ones while you do that base layer. With that said, now I'm going to take a lot of the titanium white, go down to the highlight that we mixed for right there, and we'll make it a little bit brighter and yet again a little bit less blue. So I'm using that as my reference. I want something gray, so we'll get a bit of Mars black. It's certainly less blue. It's a little bit brighter, and I think we're quite close to what we really want here. That might be it. So I'll try it right here because it's relatively close, or rather the closest area that I have to this, so that I can kind of see the contrast between them. And if I feel like this is a good natural progression for us moving forward here. So let's see how this works out. I'm just going to work some edges, work around some of these darker areas. And with acrylics, I generally say not to kind of scrape that paint and grab it from other areas, otherwise you end up with thin areas. But I actually think it's a good idea with oils because it gives you a lot more room to play later on with that area. It does mean you need to go back and do a bit more layering, but as we do the details, we'll do that anyway. So I'm kind of scraping that paint out until I get a relatively good application and a good stretch as well. I really don't want any paint built up in one area or another at this point. But anyways, I'm just going to continue. I think I might make it a hint brighter, but I don't want to make it too bright because I still want to be able to come in with some additional highlights over that bright area, giving us another value and another way of showing depth. But again, the light is coming this way, so the right-hand side of all of these protruding pieces is going to be nice and bright, and then the left-hand side is going to be dark. I'm just going to continue doing this, and then we'll talk about making the two blend a little bit, be a bit more cohesive, and instigating all of that detail we did before. So now we have these two larger rocks kind of blocked in, both highlights and dark tones, and it's time to start making them look a little bit more like this. So I'll start by mixing a little bit brighter of a highlight than what we used here. This is the highlight that I did use. So we'll just take some titanium white, hint of Mars black, hint of our blue, work those together, make sure that it's lighter than that. I do believe it is. And then we'll come back in along some of these edges, sharpen things, work it into this dark area, and you can see I'm coming down with different slants that eventually build their way into our highlighted area. Like that. Here I'll just do a little application that doesn't necessarily blend or touch anything else. It's kind of solitary. And then we'll blend back some of those highlights, keeping the right hand side nice and sharp. We'll blend this down into here, which will bring a little bit of that dark up. And I'm just working my way left to begin here. I'm also going in and softening some of those dark areas, blending them out. This is going to give those areas a little bit less of a hard aesthetic, but it's also going to make them feel nice and cohesive. These are rocks, so they are innately rough, they are innately hard. However, they aren't that close to us really. So you're not going to see all of those super sharp details. Not yet. So it's okay to soften some of these edges a little bit. I kind of ended up with a strange shape up here, so I'm just trying to play with that until I get something I like a bit more. I like that. That's good. And then I think I'll soften some of the shadow, doing a bit of blending. Grab more of our highlight. You can see how I'm just moving one into the other from those edges and then letting it subtly progress in both directions. Have to be careful, we might lose the separation of these two though. Of course, we can also mix that darker pigment. A little bit of black, a little bit of blue, a bit of white. Work it back in. Create some of these little fissures in the rock throughout. And this is a little bit too blue, so I'll take slightly more Mars black in our mixture. Much better. This of course is looking really quite stark right now. So what do we do about it? We just go in and we soften generally to the right, keeping that left hand side relatively sharp. So give it that good balance of rock but still being in the distance. There we are. You can still see some orange showing through the thinner areas of the layers, which I really like, because we don't have a lot of color in these, and just having a hint of warmth poke out in the way that it is really beautiful. I know rocks are a pretty difficult subject for a lot of beginners, and I know it really was for me. It was something I loved the visual of, and it's something I really wanted to master. It took me quite a number of years, but you know, it just goes to show. You put the time and effort in, and you will find the results. But these are just the basic techniques. Might take a couple of different tries and applications, but you'll get there. You can see that I'm slowly building it out here to the left now, because the right has a fairly good application. I think it could be slightly more detailed over here, just have some darker little indents and things, but I'll go back to that using the paint that I grabbed from over here slowly. And this is starting to look nice and cohesive with that. But remember when they were both just as blocky as they were? It's a good sign to trust the technique and continue forward. Don't get frustrated, don't give up. Just keep trying. You will learn, and you will get there. Mine didn't look perfect from the beginning, and it wasn't meant to. And that's okay. There we go. Now I think I'm going to continue doing this. I'll do this rock, and then yet again we will move forward with our painting. So here we have our two sides now filled out, and as you can see we progressively get less blue as we get into the foreground, and the darker tones do get darker. We're going to do this a third time with this area right here and with this area right here. This time, however, we're going to take our Mars Black. This is our previous dark mixture, so we'll mix right beside it, like that. We will take just a hint of our blue. We're getting closer and closer into the foreground, so we're using less and less of it. We'll use even less white, because again, we want it to be darker, we want it to be a little bit more saturated, and we're even going to grab a little bit of our brown as well. Give it a bit more of an earthy tone. So I'll come in from the side, make some of these sharper impressions, and as you can already tell, this dark tone is darker than what we have right there. It might be a little bit too dark. You don't want it to be a pure black or anything really that close to a pure black. You do want the brown to show through. You do want a little bit of the blue to show through. I'm going to leave a little bit of that orange right there just so I remember that I want trees right there. But down here you can see that they're actually starting to blend and mix quite well, and I'm going to take a bit of this and I'm going to just blend it back into that previous one. That way it's nice and cohesive, and it feels like we're just following the rock up into this new one right here so that they look like they're connected. Head back to my palette, grab some more, come back to an edge, just start scraping that in. Remember, you can scrape with oils because we don't want the paint building up and getting too thick in any area before we've fully added all of our highlights and texture and all of that. Now we're going to move in even closer, take some of our titanium white, work that into that darker mixture, and we're going to come along the edges like that because the light's going to wrap around it a little bit. You can tell that the edges here are slightly lighter, and the same is going to apply here. So I'm just taking a little bit of this brighter pigment, working that edge, and you can see that it's slowly building. Now I have a lot of dark pigment on there right now, so this light pigment, it's really getting eaten up quite quickly, which isn't necessarily the worst thing right here because we don't want it to accidentally be too bright, but it is a good reminder not to add too much pigment in your base layer. I think I added a little bit more than I should have here. But nevertheless, I'll continue just adding additional highlights to these edges. And then I'll bring slight portions of them in the same way we did with all of our other mountains here. There we go, that's a nice highlight. Bringing it down, blending it back. I'm using this smaller brush right here, just because it's so efficient for these details. And then we're just creating little rocks and separations in the same way we did before. This time though, we're leaving the majority of this dark. Now we're going to take some Mars Black, bit of our brown right here, just the smallest hint of a blue, and again the smallest amount of a titanium white. We'll mix that up. It's incredibly dark. It's almost a black, not quite though. And I'm going to work on the right hand side here. But this is where it gets a little bit complicated because we have a tree here, we have a tree here, a tree here, we have lots of trees at the bottom. So I'm just going to kind of roughly work this in initially. I made a mistake last time of applying too much pigment to that last area of rock. So this time I'm really going to move what pigment I have out, do a lot of blending, make it really thin. But I'm going to keep the general positioning of the trees that I have drawn in here. Grab a bit more paint. With that said, I'll just do a quick sketch here of the outline of all of our trees. That way you can see what I'm filling in here and what I'm not. So I'm essentially doing this area right here. So we now have our darker area blocked in, and it's time to do the lighter area right here. And in the past, we did something very blue, and then something slightly less blue. And now as we get to the foreground, should we just take out more blue? Should we continue to make it more of a black and white? The answer is kind of yes and kind of no. I'm going to use a little bit of the brown that we've been working in there as a good part of our base. So I'll use a lot of brown, a hint of black, and then we'll grab a lot of white here. And we'll make something that's relatively bright to what we've had. Something that value-wise matches that at least. And then I'll come in, work those edges. I'm going to have some different movements in the rock here, which is why you'll see some funny little brush strokes. There we go. Now I have quite a bit of paint here on the canvas, so I'm just going to start spreading it about rather than getting more. As you can see, it's a little bit dark. The more we blend, the more that's notable. And that's okay. We can go back and increase the highlights of it because we didn't apply too much paint early on here. So I'm just filling this all in like that. Then I'm switching to the smaller flat-headed brush, getting some titanium white, making a brighter version of that pigment we just applied. Find some areas that look like they're really going to stand out here. You can see just how close the highlight is to that. So we'll need to use quite a bit of this here. Make sure that it does start to pop more than what we have there. Remember, I'm making those sharp lines and then I'm blending back to the left. And then I'm working my way down and into those darker edges, progressively, slowly softening things. Grab a bit more of that highlight. Now we are getting significantly more close to the ground at this point, so I'm also going to start incorporating a little bit of a green. But it's not going to be a very saturated green because it's still a little bit farther away, so I'll grab some of my yellow ochre, I'll grab a hint of my blue, and just like that you can see a nice, not too vibrant, not too bright green. And I'll throw that right into a lot of this grayish brown that we have, and I'll start using this in between some of the highlighted gray rocks that we have, and I'll even cover up some of those highlighted gray rocks with this and create some highlighted grass areas that are kind of on a mound. Just like that. Now we're finally going to start incorporating a little bit more color into our painting. Though I will jump back into that gray color that we have. And I'll do a bit more of it, kind of create some additional rocks. You can see that there are some orange little triangles left out, and those are just going to be trees that we'll incorporate in a minute. Not quite yet though. Make a bit more of a darker green this time. Add a hint of Mars black to it, that way it's not too saturated. And I'll have this start to kind of move down this rock and into the darker areas. And that way we have a bit of a transitional green as well. I think we'll get a little bit closer, that way you can see some of the detail action that's going on here in just a second. Okay, let's move a bit closer. So here we are. From this view, it probably looks a little bit less reflective too, which is good. I'm mixing that green with, again, yellow ochre, taking a little bit of that blue, mixing those together. If you want it to be a bit brighter, you can use a hint of titanium white, but that'll desaturate it a little bit. Or you can use a little bit of this yellow that we have down here, and that will make it brighter. It'll make it a little bit more yellow, but it'll saturate it significantly more. We want to save the majority of this for later on, because we want those nice saturated highlights, we just don't want them quite yet. So I'm just building up my greens. And here you can see they're working their way down now. I'm leaving darker little areas in between to show depth, that different areas do protrude, catch more light. But this definitely implies that the majority of this is a green. Again, good amount of titanium white and just a hint of the yellow for the more highlighted areas here. Let's also do a couple trees together. So I'll start with a bit of Mars black, bit of our yellow ochre, a little bit of our blue, create a nice dark base layer. Start at the top, because that's when I have the most pigment and that's how I can create the sharpest application. I'm applying slightly more pressure as I move down. As you can see, it's expanding the stroke. I need more pigment for the next. Starting soft at the top, applying more pressure, more pressure, more pressure. And then you can add these little pieces that kind of leaf out here and there. Add a good number of trees here, and we'll even have them coming down on top of our grass. So they're not just behind, they're also in front. There we go. Adding pigment right here might be a little bit difficult because that underlayer is still wet and you might get a bit of a blend, but if you touch it with a very soft application, you will get the application you want. I'll do a good number of trees right here. These ones will be a bit farther away and clustered together, so it'll be less detail oriented. More yellow, more blue. A little more blue, hint of our black. I think we'll move this tree a little bit into the foreground here in front of the grass where this one will be behind. And I'm just trying to create a lot of diversity through these different choices and applications. Then I'll create a highlighted green. So yellow, hint of blue, a little bit of titanium white, and an even smaller amount of yellow. Then I'll take this and I'll just tap it along the right hand edge of our tree to show that there's a highlight coming this way. Almost there. Try to keep your greens relatively consistent with what you have down here in the grass. And if you find that you're making something consistently different, work it back down into the grass. That way they're nice and cohesive and they work together. These trees are quite far in the distance though, and so you don't want them to have too much detail at all. These are supposed to be significantly more subtle than what you'll have in the foreground. There we go. It's really nice. We can also work in a little bit of an extra rock here or there. Take some black, white, a little bit of brown. And just tap in a couple of different areas. Space out the greens a little bit. And you can even work that down. So last night my partner, she ended up doing a lot of pour painting and it's super neat. But while she was doing that, I decided to do some of this painting, mainly just reworking the trees and the grass, and I got to a point where I started doing highlights, but I left a good number of areas to still show you how to do them. It's not something we could have done all together anyways because I did spend a couple of hours at it and it does require some real time, but here are the techniques and how to just kind of go about that. So I'm going to take my smaller brush like this, I'm going to head to my palette, grab a bit of our brighter yellow, a little bit of our yellow ochre, not too much, small hint of our blue, mix those together, we'll grab just a little bit of titanium white, And then we'll brighten it once more with just a hint of yellow. Now I'm going to come back and I'm going to say, okay, the light's coming this way. So the sides of all of our trees, the right-hand side, is going to get this little tap, this slight highlight, just like that. And I slowly just kind of build it up in different areas. And if I feel like something really deserves a lot of light, then I'll come back here, I'll grab some extra yellow, I'll mix that in, and then I'll kind of go over one of those areas again. Now in regards to the grass, as you can see, it's all done in these little strokes that are moving that way. Here I'll just combine a couple more, like that. And I'm just kind of leaving different areas of rock to show through, combining these strokes, and just making it feel cohesive. Not using much paint at all. And then over here you can see that it kind of winds its way up. We can create different levels. We'll do another one like this, so we'll have it kind of trail into the back there. We'll keep the right hand edge nice and sharp, and then we'll do a little bit of a blend back just like that. Now as you can see, this is a little bit more green where the rest of them have a hint more yellow, so we'll add a hint of yellow ochre, a little bit more of this. Work that on top of and into, and then I'll just start blending back. Now because it's been 24 hours, this has started to dry a little bit, so you see it's not blending in with all of that dark pigment that we had underneath to the same extent. So I'll just take a bit more of our darker green, some Mars black, a little bit of blue, a little bit of yellow ochre, bright yellow. Just fix that up. I'll work it underneath and then I'll blend up into it until I feel like it's as subtle as it needs to be. And we can work that pigment down. Now this is going to look a little bit more poppy than everything else because it's a bit more wet than everything else and therefore it'll be reflective, but if you find that it is a stark difference, just go in with a little bit more titanium white, brighten up that pigment until it starts to blend in with everything else. Just like that. But we can continue with our green by just working it on the sides of some of these mountains near the bottom where there might actually be some greenery. Like that. Just keeping it really, really subtle in the background here. I'm not adding much pressure at all. Now, while we're in this area right here, I'm going to head back to my palette with a clean brush. I'm going to take some titanium white, just a hint of Mars black, mix those two together, grab a hint of our blue, significantly more titanium white, and we'll go back into the painting with this nice highlight along some of these edges that are protruding. Because I felt like this area was quite bright and this will get a similar amount of light. Now I feel like that's a little bit too bright, so we'll darken it just a hint. Get some Mars black. Give that a shot. Test it up here with the rest. It's close. Again, I think it's slightly too bright. This is another good reminder to not just go with the first color you have. Still darkening it slightly as we go. And it looks so bright when it touches the canvas now, because again, it's not blending with all of the base layers in the same way. and we're getting something that's significantly more stark. We're applying paint on top of paint instead of paint into paint. It's much more of a wet into dry technique than what we did yesterday. And as we move farther down, we start to lose that light, we get more shadows, and so I'm just letting it dissipate and get a little bit darker the farther down we get. Now I'm hopping right back down into here, and I'm mixing up a darker green for a couple more trees. I feel like we did a lot of trees down there, but it's such a complicated area that I don't think more trees will be a bad thing. So I'm just trying to find all of the pigments that'll make something nice and dark. We'll start with some vertical line work, like that. Make some highlights. 1 yellow, 2 yellows, little titanium white. Grab a hint of our blue. And then I'll come in and I'll tap that right along the side. Lots of miniature taps. No real pressure at all. And trees of all different heights and sizes. They can overlap each other a little bit, connect. Can always be a nice look. Taking some of these greens, putting them elsewhere just so it's nice and cohesive. Create the implication of some trees in the distance with just some taps of highlight. Yeah. I think we made that area look significantly more interesting rather quickly. Just going to make this a little bit less blue. So I'm using more Mars black, a little bit more titanium white, and I'll just go over that darker side again. Now I'm going to take my larger flat-headed brush, going to mix up a really nice dark green, so I'm using a lot of blue, I'm using a good amount of yellow ochre, and I'm also using a good amount of our lighter yellow to start. Then of course we're taking some Mars black and the smallest hint right now of titanium white because we're very close to the foreground, so our shadows shouldn't have that much gray in them. Now I'm going to start working in the background here for all of our foliage, and as you can see, this pigment slightly different than the more brownish gray that we have right behind it. And that's exactly what I wanted. I wanted something that was incredibly close, but still a little bit different. And I'm working initially here, right around our trees, so you'll see lots of these orange vertical pieces continuing, because these trees are really very much in the foreground and in front of most of what we are currently painting. So we'll just apply that, build it up a little bit more maybe, figure out what's in that area. It's another tree, okay, good. Once I know I like that color, I can go back, mix more. Generally pretty apprehensive about mixing a lot of a single color initially. Like to kind of try it out and then go back and mix more. And that's especially true with oils, just because they can be so stubborn in changing their colors. They get muddy quickly. So again, we did our little test. Now we're back doing a bit more of this. There I have a rock, so I'm avoiding it. Here I have a nice big bush. And we'll bring that down to about there. Then over on this side, we have a tree. Nice big, almost fluffy looking one. Fill that in. Remember, don't let too much paint build up in any one area. That will really hinder our ability to create highlights. Just kind of filling in the areas I want to paint. That way I know exactly what I'm doing. Okay, so once I have all of those darks filled in, I'm going to mix a lot of our highlight that we've been using. And this is something I'm fairly confident mixing just because we've done so much highlight as of late. Here I'm using my brush, and as you can see my brush is getting a little bit diluted. It's kind of full of paint right now, which can make detail a little bit difficult. So if you find that your strokes are suffering, just go and clean your brush and then you'll get a much more sharp application. But here now I am in the foreground. I'm looking at the right hand side of the tree because again that's where the light's going to come in and hit. I'm going to do lots of these little taps and strokes. It's kind of a tap and then it's a wisp in one direction or another. I'm trying to continuously change it. I'm applying a little bit of pressure and then a lot of pressure. And that's also going to give me a slightly different application each time. But here we're just applying a lot of light hitting the sides of these bristles, or leaves rather. There we go. Trying to leave little openings for darker areas. And there are going to be larger patches of the tree like this right here, maybe right down here, that are going to be darker as a whole, but they might still have a little bit of highlight working through them. But they're going to be darker as a whole because it's a three-dimensional subject, and that light is going to hit this edge, it's going to start wrapping its way around, and then about here you'll start to lose a little bit of that light and it'll get slightly darker. But there might be another area that protrudes out, like say here. And because it's farther out, it's not blocked by any of these or their shadows. And so it's going to be brighter. But then it might quickly dissipate because maybe it's not all that large, it just sticks out a little bit. Different things to consider. And then as we get towards the bottom, I'm just letting that paint run out because that bottom area is going to have a lot more shadow than everything else. Still want hints of the texture in the green, so I'm continuing all the way, but not much is really changing. Going to head back now, mix up a bit more. We did use quite a bit of highlight in that little area. Head over to the set. Again, lots of little taps and strokes in different directions. I'm also rotating my brush because different areas of the brush will have slightly different pigments because we're not doing an incredibly clean blend. So different colors throughout, but they're all fairly cohesive because they are mixing together and they are in similar areas and similar subjects. These are getting farther away, by the way, so you might want to make the trees progressively darker as you move to the left. Now we are working on top of wet pigment right now, so all of the pigments that you have on your palette and your brush will look slightly darker when applied to the canvas because they are going to blend a little bit with the pigments that are already pre-existing on the canvas. They're going to dilute a little bit, and that's okay. It's It's just making it slightly more subtle. Once our detail in the trees is done, we're going to go back to our palette, grab some Mars Black, find a good spot for that, a little bit of our brown, and a hint of our titanium white as well. And this is going to be the base pigment for a lot of our rock here in the foreground. We want it to be nice and dark, but still have a little bit of that brown coloring, and also not be entirely black. So we do have a hint of white in there as well. This is just going to be our base layer, so we will be building highlights on top of it, and it should mesh relatively well with what we have right in here because the shadows are going to be very similar. We're at a point in the depth in the painting where they all kind of share the same shadows. So I'm just trying to create something that's nice and cohesive, has a hint of color, but is also really quite dark. So I'll work this, initially at least, into all of the areas of rock that are not facing the light here on the right hand side. And it's going to mean a lot of jumping around, and I'll probably end up changing a lot of the forms as we go, and that's okay. But we need to start somewhere. So that's what we're doing. Rock kind of moves down, up, then maybe it gets lost in the background here. Then we'll switch to a bit of a highlight, get some extra titanium white. There we go. We'll work that in. And these rocks are going to be completed a lot like the mountains in the distance. We're applying a darker layer on one side, we're applying a lighter layer on the other, and then we're switching over to our smaller brush, taking a bit of highlight or darker tone, and we'll just start blending one into the other with these little strokes, looking to get some sharp applications in there, but also soften areas as well. And you can see that it's already creating different forms. We'll need quite a bit of highlight right over here because it's really on that edge. There we go. So I'm just going to continue reworking all of the rocks down in this area. And then I think we can start working on some grass together. But while I do this, I am, remember, just going back and forth between the lighter and the darker pigments. You want both, you want a good balance, and you want lots of little touches and textures. It also is connected with this rock, so make sure they're cohesive as you go about this process. That's a nice sharp line. Now that we really are in the foreground, we do want those clean applications. Things are going to look a little bit more sharp. The eye can recognize more specific colors at this point. There we go. Starting to look really nice. As you can probably see in the background, the rocks are done, but if you look at the brush that I've been using, the bristles are really frayed and they keep getting smaller and smaller. They keep falling down in this little metal piece right here, and I'm having a hard time using this brush at this point. So I'm switching over to this one. Oh, there we go. It's a little bit bigger, as you can see. It's a little bit wider. It's not as wide as our other one, but it will do the job for today. I don't have another small one this size, and I know I can do the job with this one. But if anything, I hope this just kind of reminds you that You don't have to have the exact same brush. It doesn't need to be the exact same size. It's more so about the techniques and how you implement the brush and the bristles that it has. So with that, I'm just switching over to this one. Again, it's a little bit bigger, and I'll show you it in comparison to our other one. There we go. So we'll continue now on the grass. So to start our grass, I'm going to take a little bit of our Mars Black, a good amount of our yellow ochre, a bit of our brighter yellow, and a bit of our titanium white. And I'm trying to mix more of a medium green here. It's not too bright, it's not too dark. It's just something to kind of get us started that we can implement shadows into, but also highlights into. So I'm working right down here, and I'm just kind of focusing right now on covering the pigment here on the canvas. Now I did switch my brush, and as you can see, it can hold significantly more because it is a little bit larger, a little bit wider, which is nice for this sort of thing. But I don't think you have to go to a larger brush to do this. I'm also working on a little path, as you can see. So I'm leaving that part orange. Now as we get back here, things are going to change a little bit because we have shadow from this rock. So I'm going to just take a little bit of extra Mars Black, work that in there, and give that part of our grass a little bit of a shadow. That same shadow can be implemented over here and a little bit over here. But then we get back to our slightly lighter greens. So I'm taking a lot more yellow and a little bit more titanium white. It's a pretty dramatic difference, as you can see. Still just working around my trees. Build some more highlight here. Hint of blue, of course. And this is much brighter, and we can actually use it for the highlighted areas. So the area right here, it's kind of protruding. It'll catch a lot more light than anything back here. So I'll just start layering on the slight highlight, building that a little bit. I'm not applying too much paint though, because remember, the more thick paint you add, the harder it will be to work with. Now that the grass is done, I'm going to take some of our white, just find a new clean area here on my palette. I'll grab a little bit of Mars Black, and I'll grab a little bit of our brown, and I'll mix a mid-tone yet again for our rocks right down here. And I'm going to use this as the highlight color initially, at least, and I'm going to apply it on the right hand side because, again, the light's coming in, that's the way it's hitting. I'm going to allow it to come up and touch the grass, and you can even do a little bit of a blend from one to the other if you'd like. It'll give it a bit more of a soft look, so it's up to you. But here you can see I'm just moving forward, finding areas that are going to be receiving a little bit more light, and applying all of this. So we're just moving our way to the foreground here. There we go. We have some little ledges, which are fun. A lot of this is rock that's moving down, but then there's some pieces that kind of jet out like that. And they give us lots of opportunity to kind of create an almost stair-like effect. Make something really three-dimensional looking. So it comes down, it gets a bit more flat, it comes down, gets a bit more flat, comes down. Of course, we don't want to repeat that pattern in any place really. We want to always keep it different and changing, but it's a fun thing to start, and you can do little areas that kind of protrude out like that. It will get darker and darker as we move down, but for now this will work quite well. Have a lot of highlight right here. A little bit right there. Now we'll mix a bit of a darker gray. So Mars black, brown, and just less titanium white this time. Now we'll go in behind. It's not that stark of a difference. So you know what? I'll go back, I'll grab some extra Mars black, work that on the brush, give that a shot. Much better. And while I have a lot of pigment here on my brush, I'm just going to work it down into all of these open spaces. And then once it finally starts to run out, which amazingly hasn't happened yet. Okay, there we go. I will go back and I'll do a slight blend into our previously applied lighter pigments. I'm using a bit of a tap to give us a little bit of texture for our rock. In this process, some of those highlights will be lost. That makes sense, that is okay. The darker pigment is a little bit stronger. We just need to keep enough of them that we know where they are, so we can come back in a little bit and reapply them. There we go. Just go back to my palette, grab more of that dark pigment. Now I'll grab more of the light pigment again. With most of this we really do just jump back and forth. I'll go to the edge, apply that highlight with a little bit of a tap. I'm not applying much pressure so I can get a bit of texture. That paint can rise off the canvas a hint. And I'll work it back into these darker areas with these little taps. That way we have that texture and that brush movement everywhere. There we go. But it's incredibly subtle the farther back we get. So look at how hard all of that looks in comparison to how soft this rock here looks. It's just because we're doing a lot of that tapping effect. Here we'll make it look a lot harder, a bit more sharp. Doing little taps and drags. There we go. Now we will need more vertical falls and applications than we will horizontal ones, because I want it to look like this is falling off a little bit. There is some distance there. There we go. Grab some more of our highlight. Establish that right here. There we go. Back to our dark pigment. Remember, right behind, and then when we run out of pigment, we can do the blends. Hey there, me again. I just wanted to say I really hope you're enjoying the video. This painting, it really turned into something special for me. Again, I think it is by far the best video we've done here on the channel, and I hope you feel like you're learning a lot. With that, if you do feel like you are learning a lot, you really are enjoying yourself, please consider sharing the video and, just putting it out there to a friend or up on your Facebook. Doing things like that, it really helps the channel, but it really helps me on like an individual level. So it doesn't take much time. Please consider it, just like right now, just maybe, go share it, come right back. We still have a lot of painting to do, but I really appreciate it. So with that, that's my little halftime break here. Let's get back into the painting. Now this right-hand side right here, it's going to be slightly different than this side because remember, the light's coming this way, which means the majority of this is facing in the opposite direction to that light, which makes a lot of it in shadow. So here we'll mix up a nice dark pigment. I'll just take some of my Mars Black, a little bit of titanium white, a little bit of our brown, a little more white. I will start more so at the bottom and then I will build my way up. And the idea with these is that we're just going to make the tops slightly brighter than what we have at the bottom here. And that way we still have a little bit of a gradient, a little bit of contrast, a little bit of depth, but it's not going to be really noticeable. It'll be slight. So here I added some titanium white. I made it really bright. We don't want that. So I'll get some more Mars Black. We'll try this at the top here. We'll fill in this area. We'll do our little taps back and forth for a blend. And as you can see, it's really quite subtle to begin with. Do lots of little taps for a bit of extra texture. And I'm blending it down to the other side right here. Now this will all be water and mist, but I want a darker base layer first. Here I'm working a little backwards. I'm starting with a highlight at the top. But remember, it's not truly bright. It's just bright relative to the darker under area. Now I'll grab some of our dark pigment. Work that underneath and bring it up. I think I'll fill in that right now. You can see that with this brush, I tend to go back and forth. I don't advise that. I do advise doing more of a tapping motion, especially more so in the foreground, just because it's going to give you a bit more of movement in your brush stroke, and it can kind of visually equate to texture. So there we go. Get a bit more of our highlight. Come up to the top edge here. And now I'm working in that texture. So I'm just using the corner of the brush, doing some little taps here and there, letting it dissipate as I move down. We don't want as much of a contrast as what we have over here. So I am letting it be more subtle. But you're probably going to want to go back and do this a couple of times. Remember, it'll be easier if you don't use much paint initially. Get more highlight. I'm kind of going back and forth between blocking in larger areas without much detail and working all of that detail in. And that's just so I don't kind of fall into habits, make everything look the same. When you have to jump around a lot, you tend to be a bit more innovative. Here you can see it's starting to build up to a real highlight. Took a little while, it took some different applications, but we got there. And that's really how I'd recommend working with oils. Just take it slow, don't do anything too dramatic, too quickly. The results do happen if you're patient. Now we are going to do something we've done quite a bit of, which is mix a dark green for the base layer of our grass. So I'm starting with almost every color we have here on our palette minus the brown. Coming back over here, and I'll start applying that. I'm using the darker area over here as a reference, and as you can tell, it's a little bit darker than what we want. So I'll add a little bit of our brighter yellow, a little bit more ochre, and a bit more titanium white in there. And now we'll try this. I think that is much better. I'm using the larger brush just because I want to get a little layer down here. And I'm also avoiding our trees as best I can. But they're going to be quite small, so I'd rather leave just the implication of them rather than the entire width. There we are. Generally, I like to layer background to foreground, just so you don't have to be hyper intricate while working around detailed foreground subjects. However, this time we're doing this area first before this, and we're doing that because I forgot to paint that, to be entirely honest. Sometimes that happens, it is okay, I'm not worried about it, but for those of you who do kind of notice these things, that there wasn't a real thought behind that. In fact, there was a lack of thought behind that. But again, it's okay. Here, just mixing those dark pigments, bit of extra titanium white. Want to be relatively careful around these edges just because I really like the rock that we have here. I think I'll get the smaller brush to do that area. Once I have my darker layer over the foreground, I'm going to take a lot of this really nice yellow we have here, a little bit of our titanium white, yellow ochre, hint of our blue, just like that. We have a nice bright green. I'll come up to the tops where the rock peaks, so right there. We have another one that kind of peaks right there, another one right here. And I'll try to make sure that these peaks don't all kind of occur at the same angle. Some of them will dip down more quickly. Some will kind of rise up a little bit. Some might do both. And then I'm working this highlight back with all of these little taps, rotating my brush, using the corner of my brush. And I essentially want to cover this entire area with little strokes in one way or another. That way we get that nice texture and movement like we have over there. Of course, the pigment looks significantly more saturated on my brush and on the palette than it does on the painting because we're working over a dark pigment. But I'm just going to go back and forth with these highlights. And if I make anything too bright, I'll work in the shadows again. Here I'm mixing more paint. As we continue to blend with it, it'll probably get diluted by all of the darker pigments we have. So make sure that you're consistently going back to your palette and mixing more, as it really will make the pigment look so much nicer. There we go. See, we're back to something quite vibrant, quite light. I'm leaving the green right here at the back a little bit darker than what we have here in the midground and here in the foreground, just because I'm going to have this larger landmass right here, which is going to be casting a little bit of a shadow on this area of land. So for this, I'm going back to the larger flat-headed brush, grabbing a lot of Mars Black, a little bit of titanium white, a little bit of burnt umber, hint of titanium white again, and we'll start on the edge because, again, that's when we have the most paint. We can make the sharpest line. Really trying to stretch it out. There we go. So now we have the base mapped out. So I'm going to create a mid-tone, take a little bit of that white, mix it in with our black, head over to the edge here because the light's going to be coming through this way. We get a little bit of a light working its way through this. Start on the edge, work some lines in, and then of course do our blend. Grab a bit more. We're really going to get a significantly darker gray here than what we had on our palette. That's okay though, we can build it up slowly over time. And I'm still using the corner of my brush to deliver little details just like that. We don't want too much too quickly, but we can start experimenting and playing, as you can see I'm doing right here. Going back into areas I like that are a little bit brighter and adding more light to them. Kind of dancing around with that corner. Now I'm going to take the same small brush, get a little bit of our brown, about an equal amount Mars Black, and then again an equal amount titanium white, and I'll mix up a grayish brown, which will be for our pathway right here. And I'll just test this in a little area. I'm not going to the big one, I'm going to a little one, seeing how it looks. It's not bad. I think I want a little bit more brown, so we'll grab that. Maybe a bit more titanium white. We'll test that right beside our initial mixture, see how it changes things. I think it definitely looks better. It's nice and subtle. That was important to me. I think we'll get a little bit more of that brown, a little bit more titanium white. We're slowly getting farther and farther away from the Mars Black. Remember, over here we'll get more light, so we want it to be a little bit brighter. I'm making it in little strokes, not a single continuous one, because I want little bumps and divots. There we go. Get a bit more brown as we move into the foreground, because of course we have less atmospheric light, things are less reflective. We'll see more of the innate coloring. Again, still making plenty of small strokes. Now we have a couple of larger trees right here which we'll start working on. So I have some blue, I have some Mars Black, yellow ochre, or brighter yellow, mixing all of those, hint of titanium white, and now we have a good dark green. So I'll start at the top, a little tap, continue that tapping application all the way down. As I get farther and farther down, I'll start to run out of pigment. I'll have to apply more pressure, which will expand my bristles on my brush, which will give me a very natural taper and progression of the tree. And just like that, we have a nice, simple silhouette. We'll go back, grab some more pigment, head to the top, and do the same. That time I had a lot of green down here at the bottom which blended with it, so it didn't get a consistently larger base. So now I'm just going back in second application using a little bit more paint and filling it out yet again. Then I'm on to the next one. So now that all of that's mapped in, I'm just going to go in with a little bit of a highlight, a little bit of a tap, working my way on the right side of this tree, rotating my brush to be on the angle of the branches, and then hopping over to the next tree. As you can see, I really didn't have enough paint to do that next tree, so we'll grab a little bit more. And I'm letting the paint be rather thick right now because I know I like the color. We are getting closer to the foreground, so a little bit of texture isn't a bad thing. So I'm not pressing too hard with my brush, because the harder you press, the more you spread the paint out and the less texture you get. Now we're going to continue with our trees by taking a good amount of our brown, a little bit of our black, the smallest hint of white. I'll go up to the top of my tree. This one is really in the foreground, it's quite large. And I'll start just tapping this really dark, nice base value down here. And I will inevitably run out of paint because we are now covering quite a large area, so we'll come back, just mix up a little bit more, work our way back down, and like all other trees, the trunk should progressively get a little bit bigger as we move down here. It needs the extra size to support the tree itself. And so, as you can see, we are just following through, eliminating significantly more of the orange here on our painting, which is always exciting because it means we're just that much closer to finishing. I like to start these by making them relatively thin initially, and then once I have that sizing down the way I want it, or the shape, or the progression upwards, I can kind of move out. There we go. I think we'll also take this time to do a couple of other ones, just because we already have these pigments mixed. These are all at a similar place in the foreground, so they should share a similar value. This one kind of gets lost behind these rocks a little bit, which makes it interesting. Might make it a little bit taller here. Trying to make sure that all of our trees are slightly different heights. Now I'm going to take a little bit of that brown, a little bit of our Naples Yellow here, and a hint of titanium white. And on the right hand side, I'll tap on this really subtle highlight. I'm working it over top that dark pigment that we have. And we'll need to mix it quite a number of times because we're working directly on top of a dark pigment. It will muddy what we have on our brush and what we have on our palette quite quickly. But this will be a nice, slightly desaturated brown for the light to reflect off our tree here. And again, we're going to do this to all of our trees. I'm continuing with this little tap effect because it's going to look like the impression of raised bark, give us some good texture in the foreground, and just really make this part of the painting pop the way we want it to. Now that we have our base in there, I'm going to yet again mix some darker green, same way we've done 100 times before in this painting. Just building a nice base here. Not using much blue, but a little bit more than that. The blue on my palette here has been out for a couple of days now, so it's a little bit harder to grab. But now that we have it, I'm going to head back, going to probably brace my finger on a dry part of the canvas, and I'll start creating some little protruding branches. And as you can see, they are almost unnoticeable. And that's just because we're working on such a dark background, and we need our pigment here to be just a little bit darker. So I'll grab more black, mix that in, give this another go. It's definitely more stark, which is good. It's a little bit closer to us in the foreground, so it has every right to be a little bit more contrast heavy. I'm occasionally going to be working over the middle area because these branches are going to be not just on the sides, but in front and behind as well. And I'm starting with very small little applications at the top here, and then as I get more towards the middle and bottom, they really start to sprawl out a little bit more. Remember that some will move forward, so we're kind of moving them forward on angles, and they can also be directly forward as well, should that be a desired aesthetic. But try to play with it and create a lot of diversity. So now the base layer has been applied, and as you can see, this larger tree that's kind of in front of our other ones has these limbs that do go out and go over those other trees in the background there. Now I think a lot of people are generally initially kind of apprehensive about doing this. You feel like, well, I've done all of the detail on this one and I don't want to cover it up. But it looks significantly better, significantly more realistic if you do cover that up and you just do the trees as naturally as you can regardless of what's behind them. So that's what we did there. Now we're going to go ahead, mix a highlight, and start working that on the right-hand side. So yet again, we have some really bright yellow, a little bit of our yellow ochre, titanium white, just a little bit of our blue. There we go. Let's make it a little bit more yellow heavy, a little bit brighter because we're going to be applying it on a very dark base layer. Start at the top and work our way down those little branches with these taps. That way it's nice and thick. There's a lot of texture in there and it doesn't blend too much with the darker underlayer. With that, we should probably get a closer look at this process. So here we are. I'm just taking a little bit more of that really bright green we have going on, heading up to the top, and I'll go over these layers and applications a couple of times just because every time we do we'll be building on a slightly brighter pigment and the pigment we're applying will look brighter in turn. So remember to leave open areas. Remember that texture is your friend, and remember that occasionally it's going to go over the middle as well. So we'll go back and we'll do a couple like that. The highlights are predominantly going to be on the right-hand side, but a couple will be in that front area, and you might even get the hint of some light just grazing the back of these trees. So I like to do that once the pigment really starts to run off my brush. There you go. You can see that I'm doing this tap, I'm rotating my brush a little bit, and I'm starting a little bit higher, then it droops down, then it comes out, but it's not one consistent stroke. It's lots of little ones. Here, this branch is coming from behind. This is the brightest, most vibrant green we've used in this painting so far. Leans a little bit towards the yellow side. That way it looks really fresh and bright. Always love this. It's so cathartic. It's quite easy. And it just looks so good. The pigment is blending with that previously applied darker pigment, but that's okay. It's all looking quite nice. And I like the natural blends that are occurring. Remember, you can do slight highlights on the other side. And if you make it a little bit too bright, you can kind of just blend it back. There we go. It's making it look much more three-dimensional. We'll mix up a bit more of that bright pigment down here, and we'll have to continuously make it brighter because every time we go in, we do add dark pigment to the brush, and then we carry it back to the palette. It's kind of inevitable. So now it's the next day, and the majority of the painting is now dry to the touch, which is actually going to make this next part a little bit easier because it's going to alleviate a little bit of the blending. So I'm going to begin here with the smaller flat-headed brush. I'm going to grab some titanium white, a little bit of our black, wipe off the extra on your palette, grab a hint of blue, and I want to make a light bluish gray right now. I have a little bit too much blue in the mixture, so I'll desaturate it. I'll grab some extra Mars black, bring that down. It's a little bit of a darker gray. We'll add a bit more titanium white, and we'll just kind of go back and forth until we get what we want, which is this. I'm going to take it. I'm going to start applying it right up top here on my waterfall. I'm going to make a myriad of smaller strokes because I don't want it to look like a singular application. I want it to look like it's kind of falling and crashing, and there's a lot happening in this little area. I'm starting with a thin layer, making sure it's not too thick. I'll have this come down, cover all of the orange to begin with. And this will be our base layer, which we'll build highlights on top of. But we're not quite done. I still want it to hit this ground area right here and then start to mist up. So I'm starting from the bottom, where it's going to be the most opaque, where I have the most pigment, and then as I start to run out of pigment, I start to work my brush in this circular motion and blend upwards a little bit. And it'll create this very soft, semi-transparent look, which will have the visual, have the effect of some mist. There we go. Now we're a little bit closer. I'm going to take some extra titanium white, work that into our mixture, brighten it up just a hint. I'm going to head to the top here. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to make lots of little strokes, and it can kind of leaf off a little bit here and there. I want some of the darker areas showing through. I want it to get slightly darker progressively as we move down. So that'll happen naturally as we just run out of paint. And then I might take some more of that highlight, work it down here at the bottom, and then again make some circular strokes. Just build it up. It's going to take a lot of contrast out of the little fissures in the rock. It's okay. There we go. Head back to our palette, grab a little bit more white, grab a hint more of our blue. Make it even brighter. Back to the top. And then some taps, which of course do dissipate. And this is where it really comes together. Now we're a bit farther down here in the painting, and as you'll probably notice, the only area with a waterfall is just this little rectangle right here. This is going to be mist, and so is this. Now I'm progressively going to move from here to here. I'm going to make this mist a little bit lighter than this. So we'll just take what we had, take a little bit of extra titanium white, work that in there. I'll start right here at the back with a nice opaque application. I'm using that flat-headed brush because it's allowing me to work around the sharper edges of the foreground quite nicely. And then once I use the majority of that paint, I move to this circular motion and this blend. See that? And as I get higher and higher, I'm relieving more and more pressure. It's getting softer. You can have it kind of climbing little areas and then dipping back down. Now you might end up seeing a little bit of a line between where your darker pigment ended and the orange pigment begins, and you can alleviate that, you can take it away by just adding a bit more of that thick pigment here at the bottom, building that up, and then working it up again. There we go. So yet again, starting to run out of paint, working my way up, just like that. Now we'll go back and make it, oh my, a bit more thick. Should really clean the floor right now. That's what I should be doing. Instead of painting, because it's too much fun. But I really should clean the floor. Right after this. There we go. Now I'm going to take a bit more titanium white, brighten this up yet again, and head down into this waterfall right here. So the water's fallen from here, it's worked its way back there, through here, it's kind of under all of this mist, and now yet again it's revealed and it falls. So I'll start with the edges, just because they are where the most care is needed. And then I'll just start doing this little tapping effect down. Same as what we've done before. Just like that. I'm going to mix up a little bit of a darker version of it. So I'll just take a little bit of my Mars Black from up here, a little bit of my blue. Come down, definitely need more Mars Black than blue. Get more titanium white. Like that. I'll work this at the bottom. And then I'll just do a slight little blend up. That way we have some contrast. The light's hitting the top, it's much brighter. I'm doing a bit of a tap, I'm skipping some areas, so some are brighter and darker than others. Just like that. It'll add some texture and detail in the water. I don't want it to be truly dark though, it's just dark relative to what we currently have on there. Now we'll go back and grab more of our lighter pigment, and I'll work that back down. There we go. Good. Now we head down into the mist. Yet again, we get brighter. Start low. Then once you start to run out of paint, work your way up a little bit. This is a little bit more blue than what we were working with before. So I'll grab a hint of Mars Black, work that down. Still a little blue. More Mars Black. I'll just throw it directly on there. Now I know it's right. Start with a little bit of a darker base layer. Working in those rounded strokes. Up our landmass a little bit. You can see that nice warmth showing through too, which I love. And then we'll be careful around the edges. There we go. And I'll just fill in the rest of this with this slightly darker pigment, then we'll pick up together for the highlights. So I know I said I was going to finish this bottom area myself and just put in all of this darker undertone, but I wanted to show you the technique I'm using when I'm combining the waterfall into this. And it's really just more of this rounded stroke. However, you're going to have a slightly different effect here than you did here, here, or really anywhere else, because this pigment is still wet, and you're going to get an actual very soft blend. So I'm only blending really at the bottom, and as you can see, I'm picking up a little bit of blue, and it's moving itself in there. So that's something to be careful with. I'm going to blend a little bit of that extra blue down, just to make it look a bit more consistent. But I'm not blending high on this at all. There we go. You can do much more over on the sides. Here I'm using a softer touch. I'm getting it to look like it's kind of flipping back up this way, which is going to give us a bit more movement in the piece. Move the eye back over here, kind of fun. There we go. Now, back to highlights. We'll take some titanium white, continue to brighten this, and the idea is that you progressively get brighter as you move forward, because you see more contrast the closer you are to something, generally. So I'm starting at the bottom, and I'm doing a lot of this rounded stroke at this point, a lot of arches, just because they make a lot of sense for what's kind of happening here. It'll make it look nice and soft. And it's almost like building a cloud, highlights around a cloud. Here I'm moving it up over that darker blue area, starting to build, give us what we want there. And the more layers we do here, the less of the orange will show through, but that's okay. We'll still get hints of it. Looks nice and warm through there and there. We can have this a bit more cool to have a bit of a contrast. And it leans blue because we used a little bit of blue. Blue and orange are complementary colors. They help each other stand out, pop. So it's actually working really, really well. Here though you can see I'm still just taking more and more bright pigment, working that initially at the bottom and then up. Lots of little taps. Now the waterfall is looking a little sharp, so I'm going to go to the edges. Just going to soften that a little bit, get something that's slightly less opaque on that edge. Do a little bit of a blend in. I'll do the same over here. And then I'll do a bit more of a blend in the actual waterfall. There we go. Sometimes softer looks more natural. Now right here at the bottom, I'm just going to do a really, really soft touch, and I'm going to try to alleviate any hard edges that we've created here. So I'm using a rounded stroke. I'm just bringing that out softly. I might bring hints of this out onto the grass, like that, leaving little areas in between. Going to give us some extra detail, and you can even work it around your trees to get something really subtle in the background. You can even have some of your trees kind of get lost in it. So I'll just apply a thin layer over this one. There we go. And then I'm going back and I'm softening these further. So there we have part one. That very much I consider the beginner version, but still a very, very solid, really great painting. If you'd like to follow us along for the more complicated steps in the advanced version to get the painting to end up looking just like this, you can find the link to part two up over on Patreon. That'll be in the description, where of course, again, you can find the traceable, access to our exclusive Facebook group, and all of that other fun stuff. With that though, thank you so much for stopping by. It was a pleasure. I loved working on this painting. I feel like from a technical perspective, by far the best painting we've ever done here on the channel. So thank you for stopping by and sharing in the excitement of this one. I'll see you next week with a brand new painting lesson, or in just a couple minutes up over on Patreon. I keep accidentally touching the plant. It's not a fake plant. I shouldn't be touching it. I am sorry, plant. With that though, I will see you soon. Again, take care, and above all, as always, stay creative.